Hello! Today we're taking a broad look at the evolution of character designs within the Final Fantasy series. Now, this channel has long discussed the narratology, the lore, and the structure of these games, but little attention so far has been given to the visual and aesthetic elements that, if we really think about it, actually contribute huge amounts to perceptions and feelings and first impressions of a given Final Fantasy game. And indeed, whether it's Final Fantasy XVI and fans trying to judge the visual subtleties of Clive's concept art and the chronology of the time jumps there, or looking way back to Final Fantasy VIII when a Western gaming media unaccustomed to the self-contained nature of Final Fantasy was wondering whether Squall's concept art made him some sort of relation to Cloud Strife. So, looking at these, visual design, and in particular character design, has long been the means of eliciting intrigue, opinion, and early engagement in a Final Fantasy title, and I think it's a worthwhile discussion in and of itself. So, I have some character-specific episodes in the works to really drill down and look at specific character designs and why they work, but here in this first episode, I'd like to chart a loose chronology of where character design began in Final Fantasy, and broadly within the JRPG genre, and then look at how it evolved over time with the game's ever-shifting worlds and settings, the advances in technology, and the changing realms of RPG, JRPG and ARPG design and audience expectations there. So, jumping right in, we can look back to early JRPGs, and stylistically speaking, again talking in very broad terms here, I think there are some clear design elements, conceptual elements, and indeed personnel that have steered the course for what we see in a lot of character designs to this day. Looking beyond Final Fantasy specifically, we can't understate the importance of artist Akira Toriyama, who's probably most well known for Dragon Ball Z these days, but he is also, and I think he still is, the lead artist on the milestone JRPG Dragon Quest. He was the lead artist on Chrono Trigger 2, which have, like Dragon Quest, it has a very distinct style, and I think he really managed to bridge manga elements and chibi design elements with the JRPG genre quite early on and set a precedent there. We also have the late Rieko Kodama, who worked on Sega's Phantasy Star, which is one of the less talked about milestone JRPGs, and we have Yoshitaka Amano, who, while being renowned today for his fine art, logo designs and companion pieces for Final Fantasy games, he was actually a primary character designer and concept artist for the first two games that I think also likewise set a precedent and influenced later artists such as Tetsuya Nomura and others in the industry. Now, turning to Final Fantasy character design, from the beginning it has demanded its own approach, because while characters such as Toriyama had their own distinct style that made their mark on the genre, what was quite unique about Final Fantasy games from the very beginning was the ensemble nature and the party-based heroes that kind of made up the games. So it meant that unlike the first few Dragon Quest games, for example, which only had one hero, there was a necessity to design several hero characters that appear on screen together and would need to be visually unique and distinguishable on these 8-bit console graphics. So Final Fantasy I, when we look back at it, is quite an interesting launchpad with regards to character design, such that it has existed, because having basically adapted a character class system from Dungeons & Dragons and having a quartet of heroes that were defined by their job classes rather than having any unique names or traits or personalities, they were simply known as the Warriors of Light. The approach to character design was hinged around visually compelling job classes rather than anything else. And so, from the outset, this is where we get some of the most enduring and visually distinct design tropes that came out of Final Fantasy, such as the Red Mage design, the White Mage design, and of course the Black Mage design, each making their debut in this title. We have the Knight class, which is recalled in future instances, with the Horned armour being reused for Cecil's Dark Knight class armour in Final Fantasy IV, for example. We have the Thief, we have the Monk, and all these kind of foundational design elements introduced for them here too. So, while there is no unique character personalities in the first game, I think the simplistic approach to designing for 8-bit consoles, where artists only really had colour palettes and the opportunity to use one or two standout elements to really distinguish what a character was. So the Black Mage and their hat, prime example, made them come across on a 8-bit console really well. Now, moving into the later games, such as Final Fantasy IV, Final Fantasy VI, and so on, the approach to character design becomes more diverse still, but focused instead on personality and identity rather than player-determined job classes. And following their early experiments with character-driven story in Final Fantasy II, Square really went with definable heroes and hero identities from Final Fantasy IV onwards. And I think Final Fantasy IV is an interesting one to focus on here because it really is a turning point. And I think in terms of character design, it really bridged the series origins, where the series started with these job classes and not much else, and where the series was heading. And Final Fantasy IX did this too, I think, where the character personalities and their stories were in many ways bound up with and defined by their job class too. As Cecil being a prime example here, because his character arc sees him transition from a Dark Knight class to a Paladin class, which is reflected in his personal growth, narratively speaking, but also affecting his visual design, his abilities in battle, and so on. And I think the same can be said for characters like Garnet or Dagger in Final Fantasy IX, where she's a summoner, which very much affects her story, affects her abilities, and affects her visual design. And once more, Final Fantasy IV being released on the SNES, which is still only 16-bit graphics, there was very bold, if simplistic, design decisions being made for these characters. So we have the helmeted Dark Knight, defined by the helmet, the colour palette, and so on, being exchanged for the bright, circlet-wearing Paladin class when Cecil transitions, and that sort of thing later in the game. So very clear contrasting character palettes here. But stepping away from the adherence to graphics and technology, away from the character classes, what we also see with these fellowship ensembles and approaches to character design in the middling era of Final Fantasy, or the golden era, many might call it, is radically different approaches to the size, the gender, the colourways, the armaments of our characters, which as the games moved away, or became more abstract in their approach to character classes, reflected more about the personalities of the characters, and indeed the settings in which the games were taking place. So, taking Final Fantasy VII as a classic example, this game works and is highly regarded by many, not simply for its storytelling, but for the characters and indeed the design of the characters that inhabit that setting, with each kind of standing out in some obvious and some slightly more subtle ways. For example, if we consider the idea of silhouetting, which many artists and designers, such as Walt Disney Studios, tend to use, and is the notion that if the silhouette of your character has a unique and distinguishable feel, then they're going to have much more impact to an audience based on that. And if we take this and look at the design of Barrett Wallace, for example, who has this top-heavy, tank-like appearance with these improbably huge arms and barrel chest and so on. Vincent Valentine, who has this lanky, wiry demeanour and this intriguing claw hand. And of course Cloud Strife, who is notable for his kind of slim physique, spiky hair, and then this huge broadsword on his back. And if we look at all of this, we can see how this definitely creates an instant impact simply based on their shapes and their forms as silhouettes, without even really getting into the intricacies of colour and sort of details like that. We can see the unique attributes of these individual characters. Layering on top of that, we do of course have the colourways, and while Final Fantasy VII, 8 and 9 were afforded much better technology, being on the PS1, it still remains that having a broad ensemble of heroes on screen at once, there needs to be a means to distinguish them, and colour is a great way of doing that as well. So again, looking at Barrett Wallace, he has these earthy tones in his attire. Cid Highwind has blue and white tones. Tifa and Aerith, as the two female leads, are contrasted by Tifa being black and white colour palette, and Aerith being this red and pink sort of colour palette for her attire. And then of course we have Cloud Strife, who has the purple soldier uniform kind of jumping out of the screen at us, and then the blonde hair, which contrasts him really well with the other characters, not least Sephiroth, who again has this very monochrome aesthetic to him. So these factors, along with radically different weapon sets, which nod back to the job classes, a clear distinguishing design features that we see similarly in other Final Fantasies, such as 8, 9, 10, for example, but looking to the more subtle aspects of character design that nod more towards the world and setting we're operating in are the details that begin to get added as game design itself and technology has seemed to advance. For example, in keeping with Final Fantasy VII, there's a very clear cyberpunk or steampunk slant to each of the character designs of the hero party. Things like Cloud Strife's nuts and bolts shoulder pauldron, Sid Highwind's seemingly rudimentary handmade looking spear with all these nuts and bolts in it too, Tifa's elbow pad, or the weird armour that kind of surrounds Barrett's torso and wrist. These are sort of unifying elements that speak of a post-apocalyptic setting, not dissimilar to the aesthetics that we see in movies like Mad Max or Waterworld, where technology rubs shoulders with this salvaged, recycled raw materials sort of vibe that have been hastily, roughshoddedly turned into weapons and armour. And it's these threads of subtle visual design that tie the ensemble of characters together, but also tie them back to the world. And there's numerous instances of this, such as Squall's Gunblade, which speaks to the sort of high fantasy yet technologically advanced Final Fantasy VIII world. We have characters like Waka in Final Fantasy X with his Blitzball, which kind of ties him back in with that world with his improbably sort of sports accessory weapon. And Final Fantasy IX is another great example, because they have radically different sets of characters and races that make up that party, but they variously nod back to the setting of that game. Each of the main heroes has some flourish or accessory that nods to the Enlightenment era or the late medieval sort of period that Final Fantasy IX seems to borrow from quite a lot. So Zidane Tribal has this jabot or cravat around his neck, Vivi has this little blue frock coat, Freya has a hunter's cap, and Steiner has this armour, and almost all the characters wear these sort of kind of hunting boots as well. So that's just a great example of the subtle elements that unify an ensemble of characters into a single world, despite their broader kind of differences visually. So this is the novel approach to character design that I think was taken up and ran with by Tetsuya Nomura and others in the middle period of Final Fantasy. And I think for his part, Nomura really had an interesting approach with adding accessories and additions. Final Fantasy VII, as we've just mentioned, is a prime example of that. And he famously has a love of excessive belts and buckles and stuff like that, which he added onto characters like Squall Leonhardt, which, yes, may be superfluous design for some, but I think also does help embed characters into a certain world and setting too. Now, looking into the latter period of Final Fantasy, it's very interesting how, looking at Final Fantasy XV, looking at Final Fantasy XVI, it has been noted and criticised by some that characters have become more homogeneous. They look quite similar to one another, and indeed NPCs and wider characters in their respective worlds. And this is interesting to consider because rather than being purely down to character design decisions, I think it also does root back to technology as well, which, as discussed in the beginning looking at Final Fantasy I, it does dictate a lot of what concept artists and designers do, because why would you come up with all of these intricate designs and belt buckles and accessories if a game designer can't build that into an 8-bit or a 16-bit system? So as technology improves, we generally find that concept design becomes more intricate as well. Going from a simple black mage design to, say, Squall Leonhardt, whose fur-lined jacket was famously a joking challenge set down by Tetsuya Nomura for the game designers to try and render. So technology, it does go hand in hand with concept and character design to an extent. And since technology has allowed games to become incredibly realistic over the past 10-15 years, coming into the PS4, the PS5 era, where human motion capture, human movements, human hair, pores of the skin, all of this stuff can really be rendered quite plausibly in games now. So because of that, one argument is that the approach to design and character design has sort of recalibrated to try and create things that are as humanly realistic as possible. Because gone are the days where we relied on these big-eyed chibi designs to express emotion on a 16-bit game. Gone are, even the dialogue boxes to convey speech and emotion, which was another layer of abstraction. And instead, we have this ability to be much more cinematic and plausible, and perhaps this has halted the inclination or the desire for more abstract or improbably proportioned characters, even non-human characters. And for example, just looking at the bizarre tank of a man that Barrett Wallace was in Final Fantasy VII, the original game, and comparing that with the realistically proportioned Barrett of the remake world, we can sort of see that in action. Looking to Final Fantasy 15 and 16 in particular, one might argue that these are standalone examples, since one features characters that all come from the same place, they're the similar age, so that's why they're wearing this uniform black attire initially, and it's not entirely dissimilar from Final Fantasy VIII, where the characters come from the same place, so the character designs would have been informed by that particular setting and story scenario. In Final Fantasy 16, which is set in a gritty game world, this Game of Thrones-esque setting, they wanted that same sort of rough sense of realism and closeness to the setting of the Dark Ages. So again, perhaps these are just standalone incidental examples of why characters are much more human and figurative rather than abstract. So I wouldn't necessarily argue that character design in Final Fantasy has become more homogeneous, but it has certainly been different with these later two games. And I think it's partly down to the particular stories and settings, but also partly down to a more thorough abandonment of the job class illusions that we see in earlier games, right up till Final Fantasy 13, I'd say. So for example, in Final Fantasy 16, the key heroes of Clive, Cid, Gav and Jill each wield a sword in battle, and while they vary slightly, with Jill having this cutlass sort of sword and Cid Telemon has two swords like a rapier and a sabre, this is a far cry from pretty much every other Final Fantasy game, where each character would have a unique distinguishing weapon set that defined them and alluded to some abstracted sense of a job class. So if Jill had a bow staff, if Gav had a greatsword or whatever, something that made their characters jump off the page or silhouette a little bit better, there may have been less complaint about Final Fantasy XVI's character designs being so homogeneous. Looking to Final Fantasy XV, I think personally the character design was a neat bridge between realistic and essentially Final Fantasy. You know, a part of that had to do with the weapon sets that I just mentioned. You know, Gladio is this physically strong tank character. He sort of nods back to sort of the old warrior class. Ignis is this thief mage looking guy. Prompto, perhaps a machinist or a gunner. And beyond this, while yes, Final Fantasy XV does also lean heavily on classic anime tropes, such as, oh, the intelligent guy wears glasses, so he's intelligent, or the blonde-haired guy is the wacky upstart one. I think these tropes exist because they do for a large part work in Japanese media, and despite the main characters being four guys who are the same age from the same place, I do think they are distinguished enough to work well with one another. And personally, I think Noctis's character design, Ardyn's character design, along with others such as Aranea, Ravus, with some really strong showings in how they design the characters here. Although, another thing to note, separate conversation, but Final Fantasy 15 and Final Fantasy 16 also have a distinct lack of diversity in their character designs there too. So, wrapping up, I do think Final Fantasy character design has evolved over the years. I think there has been a departure from the more abstract and improbable and quintessentially fantasy-feeling characters, because since about Final Fantasy XII, and excluding the MMOs, we've seen a departure from the non-human party members, and we've shifted more towards figuratively real and rendering these human characters as plausibly as possible, which is partly down to the setting of these particular back-to-back games, but I also feel that with Final Fantasy's continued reinvention and periodic loops back to the past or nods back to the past, such as we saw in Final Fantasy IX, I do think that somewhere down the line we will see a return to the abstract and indeed series tropes, such as perhaps seeing a Black Mage or a Viera somewhere down the line. So there we have it, a broad strokes look at the evolution and changes of Final Fantasy character designs. If you got this far, thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed it. As mentioned, I plan on doing some character-specific design episodes down the line. But in the meantime, drop a comment below. Let me know your favourite character designs to feature in the Final Fantasy series.